and welcome to this round table about women's activism during the Irish Revolution. My name is Eve Morrison, and I feel very privileged today to be chairing a session with such a formidable group of women and historians as we have together today. So I'm going to introduce them, make a couple of announcements, and then we'll move straight in to the discussion. Firstly, we have Mary McAuliffe, who's the Director of Gender Studies in UCD. She's written extensively about women, both in the revolution and feminism generally. She has a forthcoming edited collection about the Magdalen laundries. She's recently published a book about Margaret Skinner, which hopefully we'll hear more about. She's written about 1916 and she's women and the treaty in the Civil War. And she's also also about the Irish state, about violence against women in general. Leeann Lane is a lecturer in the School of History and Geography in Dublin City University, and she's written two excellent biographies of revolutionary women, Dorothy McArdle and Rosamund Jacob, and she's currently writing a biography of Mary McSweeney. And last but certainly not least is Margaret Ward, who, as probably I'm sure most of you know who she is. But she wrote The Pioneering Unmanageable Revolutionaries, Women in Irish Nationalism, that was first published in 1995. And I just noticed today that it's going to be reissued, I think, in this month, which is great. She's written biographies of Maud Gonne and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. She's written about the suffrage movements and women in Irish nationalism and various other things. So as you can see, we have an excellent panel today. And so I think generally what we're going to do is basically follow kind of broadly chronological order to talk first about women in general in the period, and then move through the various stages of the Irish Revolution from 1916 to the Civil War. But I mean, we won't hold too strictly to that because we want to have a kind, as wide ranging and interesting as discussion as possible. Two short things before we start. Announcements. Tomorrow, the Border 100 Symposium opens, and it opens with a talk by Tim Wilson on the Altnevay massacre, so don't miss that. And also Thursday week, our panelist Leeann Lane is giving a talk about Dorothy McArdle and partition. So there's it. So let's start then. Let's just talk a little bit about what it was like for women in the early 20th century, what they could do and what they couldn't do. And it was also quite a formidable period and lots of change going on within wider society in terms of the suffrage movement and things like that. So, I mean, what was it? What could women do, or what could they not do then that they can do now?
Sorry, did you ask me or
anybody?
Oh.
Well, I suppose I'm always struck by the fact that it's very hard for a single woman, to actually make it, if you like, in the world. If you didn't get married after a certain point, what did you do with your life? There was limited access to paid employment. For my work on Rosamund Jacob right up until she died in 1960 was, as a single woman, reduced to living in shared accommodation, kind of infantilizing her in a way. As a single woman, she couldn't draw down a mortgage. A man would have to co-sign for her. So there were a lot of legal impediments, to women who didn't fit the domestic paradigm as wife and mother living their lives.
Yeah. And so were women, like, what sort of work did women do?
Well, if you think of all the different spheres, the North, obviously, if you were working class, you would probably be in the linen industry, which is the biggest employer for women throughout Ireland. But if you're working class, particularly in big cities like Dublin and Cork, you're mostly likely to be a domestic servant, or maybe working in the family business, helping in the shop or helping on the family farm. But if you were looking at the census, none of those women necessarily would be seen as being gainfully occupied, because they would simply be seen as part of the household economy. I think, but what you do start to have also is a slight moving for women in the middle classes in terms of higher education and access to that. And that starts to transform the lives, particularly the lives of a lot of women that we'll be looking at today, women who get degrees. I mean, there's not much that they can do except be a teacher. That is, so many women, and I see in Belfast coming on, so many of the women in the early stages are teachers, but also a few women, like obviously Kathleen Lynn, are doctors. So we start seeing women move into the professions, although not more than that until after the First World War.
Right. And then so women couldn't vote at the time. Could they? Well, I suppose they could vote in local elections, couldn't they? Just if they were over 30.
They could be poor law guardians. They could vote for district councils, and finally in 1911 for county councils. So everything except the parliamentary vote by 1911. But of course, that was the big key issue for women.
Right. And what was the attitude of the main parties towards? Oh, sorry, I cut over you there, Mary McAuliffe. Go on.
I think you also have to see. I seem to be an echo there, but anyway, I'll keep going. I think you also have to see the fact that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think you also see that there is a generational shift happening here as well, particularly among younger women. When they are as influenced as the younger generation of men by the setting up of things like the Gaelic League, they're very much involved in that. So it brings them out more into that public sphere that was really seen as the realm of men. If you look at Victorian ideologies of separate spheres, the women, through suffrage activism, through involvement in cultural nationalism, which is really important for women. And I think, quite a lot of work has been done on it by mostly women historians on the involvement of women in cultural nationalism, which was a segue, one of the segues into militant nationalism for a lot of this younger generation of women. But also then you have the turn, and I mean, Margaret has written about this in her works on Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and also in Unmanageable Revolutionaries, the turn from constitutional suffrage or constitutional feminism to more militant feminism. And again, that seems to be a very generational shift that's happening in the early 1900s. And Rye Foster has written then about it in Vivid Faces, this sort of, it's very confined to a certain segment of society, mostly middle class, but this young generation of men and women who are actually talking to each other, who are working with each other, which is a new development, and I would argue a radical development in certain aspects of society. And then trade union activism brings the working class women more into the public realm. Despite resistances from the male trade unionists, actually, by 1911, you have the setting up of the Irish Women Workers' Union. So while there isn't a broad and fundamental change in Irish society, which of course will impact when we get the Irish Free State set up, and that conservatism is still there and is still very powerful, there are areas where women are beginning to come out of the more domestic, and into the public sphere, which is very, very interesting to look at. But at the same time, you have that conservative thread running through. I mean, the Magdalen laundries are still running, the domination of the idea of women as mothers, married, and motherhood has to come in that way.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's two
dominant.
So there's two very interesting things that I want to bring, maybe discuss a little bit. First of all, what do we mean when we talk about men and women having separate spheres at the time, and how people thought about that? Because I mean, certainly from the reading that I've done, women were very much influenced by, even feminist women were influenced by those sorts of ideas as well, and it's quite a bit different than maybe the way we would look at it now. But then also just to think about what traditional political parties, what their attitude was towards women's involvement in politics, were they allowed, what were their families involved in? So maybe could we deal with the idea, the separate spheres first? Anybody?
Well, I think Senor Pacetta says it really well, that, we mustn't put our own views on feminism back into the past.
Yeah.
So that obviously there was the whole ideology of separate spheres, just very briefly, that there were two distinct spheres, the public sphere, which is the sphere of politics, business, warfare, main sphere, and the domestic sphere, the sphere of women. And actually it's interesting that even in the domestic sphere, it's the male householder who's actually the final word in the domestic sphere. So men and women are supposed to have innate characteristics to equip them for their roles in the spheres. Men are aggressive and competitive to allow them to operate in the competitive world of work. And I think that's coming from Victorian Britain, in the Industrial Revolution, to survive in the Industrial Revolution, to make yourself and your family move up the socioeconomic scale. You have to, show certain traits of competition and aggression. And then the women are supposed to be nurturing and caring. I think one thing that always strikes me when I'm thinking about it is the fact that within marriage, women have lesser rights than men. So right up until the passing of the Women's Property Acts, the final one being 1882, women couldn't hold any money or property when they got married, and they didn't have any separate legal existence. They couldn't sue or be sued, which would be fantastic if you wanted to run into Brown Thomas and kind of rack up a whole host of bills, because you couldn't be sued, but it would be the husband who would be sued. And in the context of marital breakdown, the husband and under the 1857 Divorce Act, he can sue for adultery on the grounds of just adultery, but she can sue for divorce on the grounds of adultery. But he doesn't sue the wife, he sues the man with whom she had committed adultery, because the wife was his property, and that man with whom she had committed adultery had damaged the husband's property. So we talk about separate spheres, and they're not equal, so even in the domestic sphere, women have lesser rights, and I think that's important to remember. I think Mary Lyndon Shanley puts it very well when she says that at the end of the 19th century, while certain changes have been effected by suffrage activists, there still isn't the concept of equal parental rights or equal spousal rights.
Yeah. Well, if we're going to talk about suffrage, Margaret, maybe you could talk a little bit about the suffrage movement.
Well, I was just thinking, following on from what Leeann was saying, that when the suffrage movement really starts in Ireland and organises itself, some of the really important issues are about domestic violence, the sexual abuse of children, the all-male nature of the legal system, and they set up the Watching the Courts Committee, and they do have a pretty penetrating analysis of what male-dominated society is like, and how judges and legal officials view women. It's very rare for a man to suffer any penalty for having beaten his wife. Usually the judge, could often say things like, well, she asked for it, or, she was well known to have been a nag or whatever. And, children who've been sexually abused have no representation in the courts, nobody to speak for them, terrified, so that there's nobody there to actually accuse the man. And they develop really quite a sophisticated analysis of all of that. It's not just that they think if women are in the legal system, everything will change and be good, but they talk so much about women being the property of men, what kinds of legal changes need to be taking place. And they talk about things like the importance of having a domestic court, a court that hears domestic violence cases. That's the kind of thing that feminism has been arguing now, currently. So I think that we're really very far ahead of society, and in their feminist analysis of what was happening. So they argued all the time for women to be, women weren't part of the jury system either. It's not until after 1919 that women start taking part in the court system, which is one of the reasons why I think the Republican courts, when they get set up underground by the Dáil, are really quite revolutionary, because it's the first time women are seen to have a voice in that kind of system and be part of it.
Yeah. No, so that's very interesting. So let's then to what kind of, was there much crossover between the suffrage movement and the women who got involved in radical nationalism and cultural nationalism? Anybody?
Yeah. Yes, you can see an awful lot of the women who were involved in what Countess Markievicz called the three great movements: the national movement, the women's, or the cause of women, and the cause of labour. So it's not just suffrage and nationalism. You also see trade union activism, and particularly among the more radical women, like the Kathleen Lynns, Madeleine French-Mullen, Hannah Sheehy-Skeffington, of course, and Margaret Skinner. And you see the influence both of cultural nationalism. Many of them grow up through going to the Gaelic League, are very much Irish language activists, and then get very much involved in suffrage activism. If you take the figure of Kathleen Lynn, she trains as a doctor, so she's obviously an outlier anyway. She's different from many other women, and having her middle class status allows her that. But she gets very much involved in first of all, constitutional suffrage activism, and then militant. Well, she isn't a militant herself, but she is supportive of the militants. And she's very much involved in trade union activism. And then, like so many of the women, gets involved in militant nationalism. She's anti-treaty when the treaty is written. And then, like so many of other of them, moves into that sort of world of social care, medicine, social work, education, when they are, I suppose, sidelined from the mainstream political currents of the Irish Free State. So many of them take that trajectory, but you also have to remember that there's another aspect of it, that we can't just look at what is happening among nationalist women. There were quite a number of women who had unionist leanings, who were also involved in cultural nationalism, which I think, is also reflective today in that small but very important beginning in unionist communities to re-engage with the Irish language and with the GAA that's happening with women like Linda Irvine. She would be sort of a modern example of what some soft unionist leaning women were, who were suffragettes, who were cultural nationalists, but were not militant nationalists.
And how do you think how did the wider political situation, the arguments that were going on around Irish Home Rule impact on the suffrage movement?
Well, of course, you had 1912 when the Third Home Rule Bill was being debated and going through the House of Commons, and the suffrage women came together to begin a campaign to have suffrage, the right to vote, included in the Third Home Rule Bill. And that's sort of a big break when the Irish Parliamentary Party basically refuses to allow that to happen. The reason being they gave is that they did not want to put anything into the Third Home Rule Bill that would stymie its course through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But you also have to look at the Irish Parliamentary Party. Quite a number of its senior leaders were anti-suffrage, including John Dillon, who said something like, the vote for women may come, but hopefully not in my lifetime. And I'm paraphrasing.
Didn't he say it would be the end of Western civilization?
It would be the end of Western civilization
if women got to vote.
He did.
I mean, Margaret,
there were others like Tom Kettle who supported it, but they took I suppose what they saw as a pragmatic position and didn't allow the suffrage to be included in the Third Home Rule Bill. And Jenny Weiss-Bauer does say later that the women's vote was delivered in 1918 for Sinn Féin, in somewhat in revenge for the Irish Parliamentary Party denying women the vote in 1912. So you can see the impact of that. And Sinn Féin was always seen as a bit more pro-women, but of course, as Margaret has written about, when it came down to it, the women had to force their way onto the platform through the League of Women delegates. So no mainstream political party can be held up as, totally pro-women. They were all they all had elements to a greater or lesser degree of
Margaret,
suffrage.
How did Hannah Sheehy-Skeffington fit into all this? What was her because she was very strong. She was a suffrage campaigner and a feminist from before she became a radical nationalist, wasn't she?
So, yes, but at the time of the Home Rule Bill, she was very much a feminist in terms of that was the most important issue. It didn't matter whether it was going to be passed by a British Parliament. The principle of citizenship for women was what had to be fought for, and women had to unite around that, and if necessary, go to jail for it. And that was her position vis-a-vis Cumann na mBan, who at that stage felt the nation was more important than the women's cause. For her, the women's cause came first. Later on, after 1916, things shift, or there isn't the same constitutional barriers for women. And I think that the proclamation, for example, is such a key defining moment for Irish women, because nobody would say that they supported women's suffrage before 1916. The volunteers wouldn't, even though people like Thomas MacDonagh, who's a close friend of the Skeffingtons, he said that he personally supported it, but he couldn't commit the volunteer movement to it. Again, they didn't want to split the ranks. Nobody did. And it's only when the proclamation guarantees equality and equal rights and opportunities, and a future government elected by the suffrage of all the people, that barrier disintegrates, if you like. And so it's much easier, I think, then for feminist and nationalist women, radicals, all in their different ways, to come together. And I was thinking about that because I'm thinking of the Irish Citizen as a feminist paper that still exists until 1920, and the women that gather around it in the aftermath of 1916 and as the War of Independence is gearing up. So you have women who are less well known, like Cissy Callahan, for example, who's a draper's assistant in Arnott's, very much an active trade unionist. But she's been the backbone of the Franchise League for years. The one that would turn out at all weathers to sell the paper, etc. The ones that you really need, but not necessarily the ones that gain prominence. Or Mary Burke Dowling, who again was, she'd gone to jail in Holloway, one of the Franchise League members in 1910, who had gone over to the British movement and had been part of that. She also joins Cumann na mBan later on. So you've got much more of a fluidity between all the women, but what they are absolutely united about is making sure, or trying to make sure, that women are a part of the political movement. And the political movement basically is Sinn Féin, but even women who don't see themselves as Sinn Féiners want to see women in this new scenario that they're all operating in, and nobody knows what the end result is going to be, but they want to see women taking their part in that. So for lots of different reasons, they all part, even pacifists like Louis Bennett and the women of the Irish Women Workers Union, they're in agreement about self-determination for Ireland. And so that unites them, and the feminist movement unites them as well.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the organizations, the radical nationalist organizations that women joined, and the different status that they had. I mean, we know that they were formally, that Sinn Féin was quite unusual in the fact that women and men, at least formally, could join on an equal basis. But it wasn't the case with Cumann na mBan. So maybe somebody could talk about basically the founding of Cumann na mBan and the ethos of it and their relationship to the just briefly to the Irish Volunteers, and then we'll move on to the 1916 Rising, because I think Cumann na mBan changes a lot. I think you're right, Margaret, in terms of their experience of the Rising. But so let's talk a little bit about Cumann na mBan first, and why they were founded.
It was established initially in April 1914 as an auxiliary to the Irish Volunteers, and it had kind of a broad-based kind of front. So you had kind of more radical feminists, or more radical female nationalists within it, but it was fronted by Agnes O'Farrelly at that first meeting, and I think probably because she was somebody who would kind of appeal to kind of a moderate kind of platform. So they were very much auxiliary, but a lot of the women wouldn't have had any problem with that. Like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, I mean, Margaret knows much more about this than me, but Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, came out and denounced them for adopting a slave-like status to men. But say somebody like Mary McSweeney down in Cork, who was involved in setting up Cumann in Cork, like she had no problem, the issue with, being a part of Cumann and Cumann being an auxiliary. The issue was about Irish independence. At that point, of course, in 1914, it was about ensuring the passage of the Third Home Rule Bill. But Mary McSweeney, who was a member of the Munster Women's Franchise League until 1914 and did believe in women's suffrage, she prioritised the issue of home rule, and then of course later a republic and nothing other than a republic. But she had no problem with the auxiliary nature of Cumann in Cork and Cumann across Ireland as it was established in 1914, because the priority was that men and women were working in their separate ways to ensure the passage of the Third Home Rule Bill. And there was in the papers after that meeting in Wynn's Hotel in April 1914 a really interesting discussion, and not just in the Irish Citizen or the kind of more suffrage papers, but in the mainstream media, about, have women the right to organise as they see fit, so a lot of the women felt, this is what they wanted to do. And again, it probably goes back to what I was kind of saying, that Sonia Pacetta said, that we mustn't put our own ideas of feminism back into the past, and that women felt that if they were in the public sphere in terms of activism, and that was quite radical for the time, even if they were doing different work to men or even auxiliary to men, that was still, a contribution.
Yeah,
and
no,
I think
that,
yeah.
Go on.
Well, now that we've got the witness statements and all of the other things, we can hear from women like Jenny Wise-Power, who's really crucial in getting Cumann set up, that, before that we suspected that there were problems because a lot of the volunteers were saying that there wasn't any need for a women's organisation. Women could just do things when men asked them to, like collect money or roll bandages. So that it was several months before Cumann actually formed. So you can see, I think, in retrospect, with having read the testimonies of the time, that it was a victory for women to get the organisation established itself. And so I can see now that they would have felt very defensive with people like Hannah G. Skeffington calling them animated collecting boxes, etc. Because it became very... really quite a bitter argument for a while, and it was, as Leeann says, publicised in the mainstream press, not just in the feminist press.
They were well able to answer back to Hannah. It was really
yeah.
good.
I mean, if you see what Mary Collum said in answering back to that, she had joined in 1914, and she said even if the men hadn't set up their own organisation, that the women could carry the militant fight by themselves. And you see that in somebody like Margaret Skinner, who is part of the diaspora in Scotland, and she joins the Anne Devlin branch of Cumann as soon as it's set up. But she'd already been training with Na Fianna in Glasgow, and had been working with the Irish Volunteers when they'd been set up there. And they saw themselves, Skinner and the women in the Anne Devlin branch in Glasgow, as sort of comrades with the Irish Volunteers. They helped them raid the shipyards to get arms and ammunition. Margaret herself joined a women's rifle club, which was set up on the outbreak of war in case the Germans invaded Britain, so the women were learning how to fight. And she says herself in her memoir that she became a great shot, and she certainly wasn't going to be using her abilities as a good shot for the salvation of the empire or Britain. It was for another.
She ended up joining the Irish Citizen Army. So I mean, was there a difference?
She was always a member of Cumann. Yeah, she was always a member of Cumann in both Glasgow, and when she comes back to Dublin in 1919, she joins the Fairview branch of Cumann, and it's in that branch that she fights the War of Independence. But when she arrives to fight the Easter Rising in 1916, because she's friends with Markovich and had met Connolly and the rest of the Citizen Army leaders, she just joined them to fight in the Easter Rising. So again, it's the complications. Like she's a member of Cumann who's fighting with the Irish Citizen Army, mainly because the Citizen Army women are armed. Connolly does give the women, including Helena Maloney mentions this in her Bureau of Military History, that he gives them a gun. He said as they were leaving that the guns were only to defend themselves, but they were going out into a rising, so obviously they would have had needed them to defend themselves anyway. But Margaret, in her memoir about the week in the Royal College of Surgeons, it's very interesting how she sees herself as a militant or an auxiliary. When she's delivering messages between the Royal College of Surgeons and the General Post Office, she's in her dress because, of course, that helps her get through the city. She's cycling along as a young girl in her, I mean, she's only in her early 20s at that stage, between the College of Surgeons and the GPO, and she doesn't get stopped, although some of her female comrades do. And she hears the proclamation being read by Pierce outside the GPO, and that it becomes, as you said, like so many of the women, a touchstone for her for the rest of her life. When she comes back to the College of Surgeons and they're pinned down there and she can't deliver messages anymore, she changes into the male uniform that Countess Markievicz had made for her. And that's when she becomes the soldier who can fire the rifle from the top of the College of Surgeons. So there's a lot of sort of ideas around gender going on, even in that one story. And I think the women are thinking about their position in society. So Cumann na mBan, really, even though if we see it as an auxiliary, and it is an auxiliary in the beginning, and for many of the branches, they remain auxiliary, it is a radical shift. It is a radical movement to set up because it's preparing these women for war, basically.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Well, we'll just talk about then quickly, because we want to get to the right way through to the end of the Civil War. So let's talk about women's involvement in the Rising and how that impacted on female involvement in the Irish Revolution generally.
Oh. Well, I think we now know there was more than 300 women. Like for so long, people
were they welcome though?
90.
Were they like what was the attitude of the men towards women? Were they?
I think the mobilisation of women is one of the key issues. When Mary was talking about Margaret Skinner, I was thinking of Winifred Carney, again, a woman who was Cumann na mBan until she comes down to Dublin to take part in the Rising, and she's the adjutant for Connolly in the GPO. But he has said that, it isn't a citizen army and the volunteers were now all part of the Irish Republican Army. And so she saw herself very much in that mould. And in fact, when she's applying for her pension and is treated very badly by the pension assessors, argues that she should have been given officer status at that time. So women were always having to prove what they had done, prove their status. So when the Rising starts, Cumann na mBan itself isn't mobilised in the way that the Citizen Army women are. The Citizen Army women know all of what is happening and they're out, so we have Lena Maloney and her colleagues going to the City Hall with the men, etc. Whereas we have the women trying to find out what's happening and going to outposts and at first being turned away and then coming back. We've got Catherine Byrne talking about smashing the window in the GPO and jumping in. She knows her brother's there, but the men won't let her in at that time. So women at the beginning, it's only eventually that some come to Pierce and say women are having a problem, and then a general mobilisation order goes out. And of course, famously, De Valera in Boland's Mill doesn't care about that. He says it isn't a place for women and he wouldn't let them in. But when we hear of different stories of what women did, so in Marrowbone Lane, for example, which was a very young group of women, where they're doing things like holding up for food, commandeering chickens and milk and bread, etc., because it's an insurrection planned by men, and there is no provision for food in any of the garrisons, and it's the women who are improvising all of that. And I think it's really interesting just to write about the food in 1916 and how it's acquired, and do a kind of gendered analysis of that.
And also, I think it's interesting, it's kind of sometimes, it's just kind of said dismissively that women were just cooking and, providing medical care. But this is cooking under fire. This is, providing medical care under fire. You have the potential to lose your life. if you are, those who were involved in organising the rising had no real kind of military know-how, and they didn't think about how to actually connect up the various outposts they took. So women were given the role of dispatch carriers. And, of course, as Mary said, they were less likely, certainly in the early days of the rising, to be searched because they were women. But, Catherine Byrne, to just refer to who Margaret talked about there, she talks about literally going from, various outposts under fire late at night. Women were not supposed to be out in public late at night. So this is very, transgressive of gender roles in the period. So yes, a lot of the women aren't out with guns, but it's still very transgressive. It's still very radical, and it's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's certainly, I think so. And so if what did the impact of being involved in 1916? How did that impact on the women in Cumann na mBan and the women who've been involved, like on their sense of themselves and their role in the War of Independence or the fight for a republic?
Well, I think the Cumann na mBan conventions in 1917 and 1918, they indicate that they want more equality with the Irish volunteers. They make reference to Irish women taking their right place vis-a-vis the proclamation. So Mary talked about the proclamation as a touchstone. So in those conventions, they talk about arming men and women and ensuring that women take their rightful place in the nation, and also, of course, like there's male internment after 1916, so it becomes the role of women to keep the idea of the Republic established name outside the GPO alive in that kind of period when there's, after the executions, while the internment is occurring, and a lot of women had lost loved ones, and so they kind of take over, if you like, the role of carrying on the male sacrifice. That's not to say that they're not active agents by any means, but just jumping ahead for a little bit, after Terence McSweeney's death and hunger strike in Brixton, like Mary McSweeney could not do anything other than say no to anything except a republic, because she had witnessed her brother die on hunger strike, of agonizing, protracted death. So it's dismissive to say, as one historian has said recently, that Terence was a weapon in her armory. That's not to actually understand the trauma she suffered. And also, she genuinely believed in a republic herself. But I think after 1916, a number of women, Kathleen Clark, had her husband had died. Grace
her brother.
Her brother. Yeah. So that they've become radicalized, if you like, by 1916. They've seen action, they've seen what they can do, and they're needed.
Yeah, and I mean, Kathleen Clark still had to look after all her children as on top of all her activism.
She also had a miscarriage.
Yeah,
and brought on by the stress of the rising.
Yeah,
but I think it's very important to look at the propaganda effect of the widows of 1916. Particularly in that publication in December 1916, which the Irish Catholic, what was the name of the magazine again?
The Catholic Bulletin.
The Irish Catholic Bulletin, yes, which focused in on the widows and orphans, I suppose, the children left without fathers of the executed martyrs, as they're the patriotic martyrs, as they're now being constructed as, in 1916. And you had Hannah Shee Skeffington, even though obviously Francis hadn't been executed as a signatory, he was murdered during the rising. You had Kathleen Clark, you had Anya Kant, you had all of the widows and mothers, Mrs. Pierce, of those who had been executed. And that was powerful. It was one of the few publications that hadn't been suppressed under Dora, and it was able to put out that edition, which went into several printings, just demonstrating the strength of these women continuing on the Republic, which had been proclaimed in 1916. And of course, they're also doing practical work, like Kathleen Clark had been basically told by Tom Clark, or had conversations with Tom Clark as to what would happen afterwards, and entrusted with money to continue on reorganizing, refunding, rearming the Irish Volunteers, reorganizing Cumann na mBan. And with all the men away for most of the next year, it is the women that really construct that idea of the Republic that will become so powerful to activate when it comes into the War of Independence.
Yeah. And so what did women do during the War of Independence then? Did their role obviously change because like the 1916 Rising lasted for a week. You have something from 1919 to mid 1921. You have basically an insurgency going on, and so what sort of things did women do at that stage? Did their role change?
Well, I think the like Margaret made reference to the Bureau statements, and I think we know now from the MSPC that women's roles were much more diverse. And I think what's really interesting that's emerged from those files is the fact that certain women were recruited directly to the IRA. That Michael Collins, in fact, told some women to leave Cumann na mBan so they would go off the radar of the British government, and he recruited them to work directly for the IRA. But because then they went off the radar, it was much more difficult for them at a later point then to actually claim a pension because the necessary corroborating evidence wasn't there. But like, I mean, again, what I'm always struck by is how dangerous the work they did, and that so many of them talk about how this is full-time work. They're, even if they're not maybe using guns, they're hiding guns, they're at the ambushes, so they're under fire, they're carrying dispatches, they're keeping safe houses. It's really dangerous work, and it's full-time work. And that's what I'm struck by, how many of the women stress that in their pension applications.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the interesting things about the pensions is, for instance, we're getting a lot more information about, for instance, women in Cork, who were probably one of the best organized groups of radical women throughout the period. But we didn't, they didn't give that many witness statements, and they were also Cumann na mBan was aligned directly to, they were kind of assigned an IRA company or a unit to work with. So, and they worked quite directly with them in a way that I'm not sure happened in other parts of the country. And we actually didn't know that much about them. And we're learning a lot about them now. Go on.
I'm very struck about women in the North as well. It was almost impossible to know what they did before because of the dangers of still being in a very hostile state. People didn't talk about it. But looking at the witness statements and the pension applications, I mean, it was incredible what women did. From the very basic things, how do you send messages that women set up this very elaborately contrived series of safe houses that stretch from Ballycastle in the north of Antrim all the way across to Lough Neagh in the west, so that messages could be passed. All of that was done by women when active service unit was set up in Cavan and it had to be equipped from Belfast. It was women who put all the weapons in golf bags and shopping bags and things and went on trains and carried them, literally, things like that. One man talked about a woman wheeling a handcart through Belfast streets filled with ammunition and guns and a feather duvet mattress or something on top of it, because it was too dangerous at that stage for men even to be seen on the streets. So women were doing things that men could not be seen being done visibly at all. And as it becomes more and more a guerrilla warfare, it is, it's the women from the home who are doing the safe houses, looking after the wounded, feeding them. And one of the things you notice is how many, their health suffers so much, because we have photos of women with their bikes and we hear about them cycling enormously long distances with their messages, but they're out in all weathers. They're delivering food and clothing to men out in the mountains, doing that after dark, after curfew, etc. Really dangerous and also very injurious to their health.
Yeah, Bridie O'Mullane talks about how, at the end of the War of Independence, she's down to about 6 stone and that her health is extremely unwell because, and she does talk exactly as you're saying, Margaret, about, cycling. She cycled around, organising Cumann na mBan branches and in very bad weather.
I've got a couple of questions that have come in. Sorry, Mary, Mary, go on and then I'll take the question.
I think one of the very important things that they do is the intelligence war. They're very much part of that. So they're not, a lot of them don't go on the run. So they're watching everything that's going on. They're watching the RIC and the auxiliaries and Black and Tans and their activities. For instance, I have a woman I came across, a barrack servant in Listowel in County Kerry, who was bringing out intelligence from the barracks itself. And the IRA sent her a threatening letter as subterfuge to keep her working in the barracks. So then the RIC used to give her an escort to and from her job. And what she was doing was collecting the intelligence about the comings and goings. And she was also stealing ammunition and arms from the barracks. So they couldn't figure out how all this ammunition was going. But what these women are doing is providing the information that the IRA and the active service units need. But also, as you know yourself from studying ambushes, the women are actually near the ambushes. They mightn't be on the front line, but they're actually there. They would have brought the bomb-making equipment or the rifles or the ammunition to the site, retreated a little bit, and then, depending on the outcome of the ambush, either helped those who were wounded get away, or if arms and ammunition had been captured, take that back to an arms dump. So at all times they're nearby. And I think Cecile, for example, Gordon in the military archives is doing great work on her blog where she looks, or the blog for the military archives, where the deconstruction of ambushes and placing, using the military service pension application, all the men and the women who were there, beginning with Salah Hedbeg. I mean, we all learned about Salah Hedbeg and the first shots fired in the War of Independence in secondary school and all that, and Dan Breen and Sean Tracy and all the guys who were there. But they never mentioned the women. But the women were actually just a couple of yards behind in Salah Hedbeg, and they're the ones who take the Gelignite to its hiding place and then set up the safe houses. And when the area got hot, with searching for the men who had participated, they're the ones who helped the men escape by directing them from safe house to safe house to safe house. Yeah. So the women are providing absolutely integral, vital service for a guerrilla warfare. It couldn't have happened in the way it did without them, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I just finished a book about that, about the Kilmichael ambush, and it's a point that I make. Largely thanks to the pensions, that if you count what the women did before, carrying dispatches and things, and afterwards, then about 100 people took part. It suddenly doubles. And also, there was 2 women who were actually there. They were bringing tea and things, but they couldn't get away. So they were actually lying against defense throughout the entire ambush. And I've never seen anybody write or talk about that before. So, and I tried as much as I could to kind of include that. And I think that's one of the most extraordinary assets of the MSPs in that way. I mean, because you suddenly get, it's in a way, it's kind of transforming our understanding. Mary, I think you're dead right in terms of how the IRA organized, how military actions were organized, that we really just didn't know before. And also it's kind of ironic precisely because they weren't taken very seriously and they were given quite a hard time by the pensions, that they had to go into a lot more detail about what they did than the men.
Yeah.
So, okay,
I mean,
I better
I was
get in there.
I was surprised to discover recently that a lot of the women were actually the ones who were keeping captured black and tans or auxiliary officers or military prisoner. They were the ones who were making sure the prisoners were fed. Sometimes they were actually keeping them in locked rooms in their houses. And that's incredibly dangerous. What if they were found in a raid to have a British soldier, a prisoner in their house?
I mean, they also used to kind of sometimes flirt with soldiers and black and tans and men to get information and get all sorts of, and I think women in guerrilla armies do that everywhere. That's just part of what they do. So I better get in some of these questions here. There's a few. Tola Collier says, thanks for a great event. I would like to ask what extent was Cumann na Mán's rejection of the treaty driven by their radicalism in the War of Independence, and do the panel think that Cumann na Mán and the cause of women in Ireland would have gained anything if the anti-treaty side had gained power as a result of the Civil War? Mary, I will bring you in here now just a second because you've talked about the Cumann na Saoirse. Johnny Doyle wants to ask, we've kind of moved on, but I'll put it in here anyway, about did the wives and mothers and sisters of those murdered in North King Street in 1916 become activists? And then finally, and this is the last one, how do you think these politically active women felt in the years after the fight for independence in an increasingly conservative Irish state? Okay, so there's a lot of meat there. So maybe we should kind of move on a little bit then to talk about the Civil War and how women were involved in that and the impact they had it on. So the thing is, so Mary, I mean, is it true? You know, I think you wrote a really excellent article, I thought, about Cumann na Saoirse. I think it's probably one of the first ones to do, though I'm sure Margaret talked about it as well. I can't in Unmanageable Revolutionaries as well. But just so, I mean, I suppose it's generally assumed that most of Cumann na Món went anti-treaty, but that's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, and Margaret did talk about the Cumann na Saoirse in Unmanageable Revolutionaries. Now, they don't last, obviously, as long as Cumann na Món, but when the convention to discuss the treaty is held, there is a significant, if minority, voice against the treaty, with some very senior members, like Jenny Wise-Power, who are pro-treaty rather than anti-treaty. And we hear, of course, about the 6 women TDs and Mary McSweeney's amazing almost 3-hour speech against the treaty. Oftentimes they're constructed as furies, but actually, as Leeann is showing in her work on Mary McSweeney, these are women who are making really solid, serious arguments based on lived experiences and ideologies and their commitment to the republic that was declared and the proclamation. Markievicz is the same. In Cumann na Món, when they discussed their treaty, I mean, when I was writing the biography of Margaret Skinnider, I looked at her. She was anti-treaty. And the big thing for her was the oath of allegiance. She said no Irishman who took an oath could consider himself an Irishman. They saw the border was important, the oath of allegiance, the fact that what they were fighting for was a 32-county republic. And this was not what was being delivered by the treaty. Kathleen Lynn, in her reaction to when the news of the treaty broke and the contents of it broke, said, peace, but what a peace, better war than this sort of peace. So, you know, they weren't willing to give up on the fight. And I think, you know, part of that was their experiences during the War of Independence. They had gone through a lot. They had suffered a lot of trauma. And again, the military applications, they talk about, you know, the terror that was visited on them, the house raids, the burning down of their houses around their heads, the physical brutality that was oftentimes visiting on them. Julia Duffy in Longford, who was a Cumann na Món member there, was beaten so horribly by the Black and Tans that 9 of her teeth fell out. You know, that sort of physical abuse. Some of them, like Molly Alloway in Cork and Babe Hogan in Clare, had their hair cropped by the Black and Tans. Some of them were you know, experienced the trauma of having to bury their brothers, comrades, friends that they knew, IRA men who had been shot. And so all of that trauma, plus their proclamation being their touchstone, meant that for them the treaty just wasn't something they could actually sign up to. And I think also the fact that nobody went, no woman went, no senior political woman went as part of the treaty delegation. Now, you wouldn't think
they wanted to, though.
They wanted to, yeah, Mary McSweeney.
Who
I know they wanted to include McSweeney, yeah.
She would have been great.
It would have been better had they done that. Maybe.
Do you think?
Maybe
Leeann,
a senior woman would have been able to bring them along.
I don't think so. I don't think she had no diplomatic skills. No, I do think there's a really interesting shift, you know, because I think, Mary, you mentioned the widows and how, you know, that was a real propaganda thing after 1916. But the 6 female deputies, you know, who debated the treaty were all anti-treaty, and they were denounced as furies, so that, you know, calling on their dead male relatives in the context of the treaty, they're treated very differently than the widows calling on their dead male relatives after 1916. And Michael Collins makes the point that during the treaty debates that, you know, we're fighting for, you know, the Ireland for the living, you know, kind of making a dig at these women who are talking about, not all of them do, but talking about dead male relatives. And to be fair to Mary McSweeney, she spoke for 3 hours. Really, really cogently. I do love when she said, I care not if I'm like taking up too much of your time. And she did denounce Arthur Griffith for sniggering. and she was palpably like distressed, but she spoke cogently, and in that 3 hours she didn't, keep harping on about Terence. Obviously it's a very strong subtext, but she talked about all the reasons why, as Mary listed out there, nothing other than a republic could be accepted.
Just thinking of Kate O'Callaghan as another one. I mean, her husband as mayor of Limerick is murdered, but when she's talking, she's the one who brings up the bill to enfranchise women between the ages of 21 and 30 before the vote's taken on the treaty. And she makes the point she was in a suffrage society. She'd always felt that women's citizenship was important, that she wasn't simply the widow of a murdered man. She was a political activist in her own right and speaks in a very dignified way. And a lot of the women felt that it just wasn't democratic to exclude women from the ages of 21 and 30. As they all said in the treaty debates, the ones who had borne the brunt of the fighting wouldn't be the ones who would be able to have a say in the future Ireland, that it was going to be taken by a different generation. And particularly, I mean, Hannah Skeffington, I think, thought about a seventh of the electorate would have been excluded by taking out those women. And also, although it's always now, it's the Furies, it's those women in the Dáil, I came across recently a very interesting comment from Louis Bennett, now, who's somebody, the Irish Women Workers Union is part of the Women's International League for Peace, very much a pacifist, but she says, we're asked to accept common citizenship with an empire whose deeds we loathe, an empire that holds down Egypt and India, etc. So, there were a lot of other people who were very unhappy at the idea of dominion status, and it wasn't, and it's terrible that it was such an easy way for the Free Staters in the future to dismiss women by concentrating on the 6 women in the Dáil.
Commonwealth Saoirse tried to counter that Fury's argument by, going along the Collins line that the treaty was a stepping stone. So that was their argument. But also they wanted to show that not all women were against the treaty. And then later on, as the Civil War developed, that not all women were these Furies, that there were women who supported the treaty, who supported the democratically elected government, who supported... And it's interesting that Jenny Wise-Power actually, she didn't oppose the extension of the electorate for the treaty election, but she certainly didn't support it in a way. And you can see the splits happening there between the comrades who'd fought together for suffrage and for the national cause all of these years. But interestingly, the Irish Free State and its treatment of women would bring them all back together again. So Kathleen Clark, who was anti-treaty, and Jenny Wise-Power, who was pro-treaty, are both senators in the Irish Free State and are fighting for the rights of women against a very reactionary Free State. Then they opposed the Juries Acts and all the other acts that limited the participation of women in public society.
I think.
But do we really think, though, looking at what Fianna Fáil did, that it would have been that, because somebody actually asked us, that would have been different if the anti-treatyites had gotten. First of all, the problem I should say is that most of the country wanted the treaty to accept the treaty, and that's what and they voted for it. So so to a certain extent, the anti-treatyites were out of step with most of what the majority of the Irish population wanted, not because they were particularly impressed by the treaty, but because they wanted an end to the war and the violence, and they thought that this was the best they were going to get. So go on.
I think in the context of like the Free State and the repressive legislation it brought in, like I think there's, that doesn't just happen in Ireland. If you think about like going to the French Revolution, in the early years of the French Revolution, a kind of a space opens up where, women are able to agitate for their rights. Olympe de Gouges issues the Declaration of the Rights of Women. But as the revolution, continues, women are pushed back into their home, and their role is as Republican mothers, from within the home, they're rearing future citizens of the revolution. And I think something kind of similar happens in Ireland, as the state is established and as it needs to create stability. Once again, that ideology of separate spheres, emerges as a dominant discourse promoted by the state and the Catholic Church very heavily. And if you like, women were needed during the revolutionary period, and they're no longer needed then in the Free State. I think it's a testimony to the fact that women were so important that the provisional government and later the Free State incarcerated women in much larger numbers than had been incarcerated during the War of Independence. Over 600 women are incarcerated during the Civil War. And then during the 1920s and the 1930s, it's kind of back to business as usual. The 1930s, of course, is a period of worldwide economic depression. There's a fear of male unemployment in Ireland. So the Conditions of Employment Act, Section 16, says the Minister for Industry and Commerce can remove women from the workplace to make room for male employment. So women have a lesser right to paid employment than men. So it's kind of like back to business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, we must say, for whatever else the Free State didn't do, they did give women full suffrage for several years, several years before Britain did.
Yeah,
so within the context of the time, I mean, I suppose I would question really the anti-treatyites. I think the anti-treatyites to a certain extent were being quite cynical. Certainly not the women that you're talking about, Margaret. But I think in terms of I'm not sure that anti-treatyites were particularly dedicated Democrats themselves.
No, I'm
either.
I'm looking at Mary McSweeney's material, into the 1920s, and when De Valera decides to break with Sinn Féin and goes with Fianna Fáil, they're trying desperately, Sinn Féin, the rump that remains, to put in a program for government to kind of show that they have actual kind of a program rather than just reactionary. But they don't talk about women once.
Yeah. No, and so many of the political women who were anti-treaty and then in the Free State or continued their activism, but they break with De Valera, eventually over his attitude to women. And Hannah says something very interesting about him in 1932, when some of the women think he might deliver for women, she had no hope in that.
Yeah. No, okay. So let's talk before, I think we should start to talk about violence against women and the kind of vulnerability of women. But before we do that, let's maybe just talk a little bit about how women's roles changed in the Civil War, because actually they played quite a vital role in the Civil War, certainly for the anti-treatyite military campaign, much more, I think, more integral than they had to a certain extent in the War of Independence. So maybe we could, Margaret, talk us through that.
Well, just to start with the start of the Civil War and the fall of the Four Courts, I found that, we've got so many testimonies now for women who were involved and how quickly they all mobilised, Bridie Klein, Maura Comerford, Nora Connolly, Margaret Skinner. So they all rushed in from their homes to the Four Courts at a time when it's been bombarded by British artillery and stay there until the end. And they're learning how to drive ambulances, how to change gears and go up and down the lanes, how to deliver messages to other outposts along O'Connell Street, all the different hotels. I mean, extraordinarily brave, but there's so few of them. I think there's 70 men and 30 women in those garrisons then. But the women stay till the end. It's very similar to 1916 when Pearce wants the women to leave the GPO. Now it's Carl Brewer saying that they've all got to leave, and 3 women stay till the end. And then, of course, they move down. They don't give up. They stay with the anti-treaty troops, and as they're pushed down to the south, you see women actually taking on more and more important roles. So that Bridget O'Mullane she's appointed director of propaganda, and has a really important role with other women in bringing out the war bulletin. Leslie Price is down organising all the women to look after the active service units, who become smaller and smaller and smaller. Maura Comerford's doing all sorts of messages and saying that, you know, it becomes more and more difficult because the men by this stage are in dugouts with corrugated roofs. How hard it is. Leslie Price says you're likely to have a man take you as hostage in the group because that was more likely to give them safe passage. So it becomes even more difficult for women. Ethna Coyle is in the north, in Donegal, being the messenger between the different battalions, the 1st and 3rd Battalion. They're so important, not so much as intelligence, but actually just keeping the men safe, hiding them. Maura Comerford takes people like De Valera from safe house to safe house, providing food to the men who are hiding out in the hills, etc. They couldn't have continued for as long as they did without the women's activity. And of course, as Leeann has said, the Free Staters know exactly how important the women's role is, and you can see that by how many they arrest. I mean, they know the hiding places and the different houses. They've been there themselves. So it's so much more difficult. So people like Maura Comerford, for example, are arrested, she says, because she's part of a plot to kidnap Cosgrave. Her car breaks down. Min Ryan sees her when she's sitting in a taxi and then goes and reports her, and she's picked up. So it's, you know, that is former comrades falling out in a big way. But women are there, and they're undertaking really difficult work, and you can see how bitter it is when it comes to their experiences in the prison as well, and the riots that particularly Leeann has written so much about in terms of Dorothy McArdle as a writer, as a propagandist, and also Mary McSweeney. The women go on so many hunger strikes. They have a really hard time in prison.
Here I've just got a question from Thomas Tormey. It says, Mary mentioned women activists delivering the women's vote for Sinn Féin in 1918. Is there any sense of the same thing happening in 1923? It's noticeable that the Republican vote increases each time women's suffrage is broadened. So, I guess the question he seems to be asking is that, do we think it's true that more women were anti-treaty than pro-treaty, at least within common bonds? Do we know?
I think you look at, I've done some work on Kerry during the Civil War, where obviously it's particularly violent. And you see the reaction of the Dublin Brigade and obviously of Paddy O'Daly's leadership. And their treatment of the women activists is pretty horrendous when they're down there. Not just the infamous Kinmare case, which seems to be a very personal thing on the part of Paddy O'Daly and part of some infighting that was going on between the officers of the Irish Free State Army there. But the National Army itself is targeting women. It's arresting them. Many of the pension applications, when they talk about their service in 22 and 23, the women, you know, they're arrested, they're taken to Tralee jail, and they might be released after a couple of days, and they have to walk home in the pouring rain. They're the ones who are, as Margaret said, they're running the training camps of the anti-treaty IRA, so they know where they are, and they're keeping them supplied with food. And every time they have to move, the women are moving with them and ensuring that they are being looked after and they're being supplied with ammunition and arms, and also keeping them up to date as to the movements of the National Army so that they can actually get away. But one of the huge traumatic things that the Civil War, well, before I talk about that, it's interesting if you look at the newspapers between 22 and 23, there's a whole load of anxiety about gun girls in the newspapers, about women being found with arms, not just in Kerry and Cork and Munster, but, you know, women being stopped in Dublin and they had a bomb on them or a revolver in their coat pocket. I mean, Margaret Skinner, who took over as quartermaster of the whole IRA, for most of 1922, is arrested with a gun, a revolver. And had she been a man under the laws at the time, she'd probably been sentenced to death, but women weren't sentenced to death if they had the ammunition. But she was put into Mountjoy and then the North Dublin Union. But what happened, particularly in Kerry, is, you know, in the terror months of April and May 23, when you have those awful massacres at Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge, Carsavine, Clashmelkin Caves, is the people who are doing the cleanup afterwards, the people who are going and collecting the mangled, particularly in Ballyseedy, the description is horrific. The mangled bodies of, sometimes one woman, her brother was there, are doing that, and they are really traumatized. And the trauma is, you can see that in the pension application, like they're absolutely psychologically damaged from their experiences during the Civil War, because they are being terrorized in their homes, they're being terrorized when they're out in public, they're being pulled off bicycles and beaten up. And for example, Gobnut Nivruder is shot at one stage in Kerry. They are then being traumatized by the, I suppose, experience of seeing their loved ones not just shot, but blown to pieces. And that's pretty horrific. And all of that comes true in the military services pension files. But interestingly, as the Civil War dies down in Kerry, and you get reports from the National Army, again and again they say, oh, the population is quiet now. Most of the active service units are too small or have been broken up. And the only opposition we have are from women. And it's the way they phrase it, it's about demeaning these crazy women. You know, these are the furies. They have been blooded. They can't stop. It's what Cosgrave said about women who's, you know, at their extremists, unmanageable revolutionaries, you know, furies. When Cosgrave comes to Tralee at one stage, he's met with great cheering at the railway station. And then suddenly up the road comes a crowd of women bearing a banner condemning him for the Civil War. And this is August 23, you know, so the women aren't forgiving or forgetting, and they are still committed to the cause. But of course, the Civil War then peters out, and then they're very easily constructed as crazy women.
I think they're traumatized also by the experience within the prison, because it's not just deprivation. So clearly there's issues around overcrowding, which creates riots, etc. And they're not a homogenous group within the prisons. They're all committed to the Republic, but you know, there's issues about how to actually achieve a Republic that divides them. But there's also a real threat of violence. So there's throughout the Civil War imprisonment, and all sites of imprisonment, there's an underlying threat of violence all the time. There's low-grade violence, but then it erupts into real violence. And there's also a fear of sexual assault, I would suggest, in the prisons, like the soldier's gaze. That's something that's repeatedly, you know, if you read between the lines, that comes out. You know, the fact that women are dressing and going to the bathroom under the gaze of male soldiers. You know, when the women are on hunger strike in Kilmainham in March, a number of them suffer from diarrhea and other kind of stomach troubles, and there aren't proper bathroom facilities where they have privacy. So that's all extremely traumatic. And the move from Kilmainham to the North Dublin Union at the end of April 1923, that erupts into whole-scale violence, and there's undercurrents of sexual assault in that move from North Dublin Union to Kilmainham. And in the context of Cumann na Saoirse, the prisons use Cumann na Saoirse women as they were known sometimes in colloquially as Cumann na Saoirseers, and they were very violent, those women, some of them. So that's all very traumatic as well.
Well, so let's talk a little bit. There's been a lot of work done now, just more recently, about the whole issue of violence perpetrated against women during the revolutionary period, and you know, sexual violence, but also violence in general. So maybe we should just, I mean, how much do we know about it for a start? Like, what are our, you know?
Well, there has been a lot of research done over the last 20 years, starting with Louise Ryan's Drunken Tans. And I suppose in many ways there was always that idea that the Tans were drunken and they were creating violence wherever they went. And it's true that they did attack women in the home. But I think we also have to look at the violence done by the IRA in terms of their coercive control of women, particularly young women who would be charged with offences of company keeping. And that would be, you know, stepping out with or being seen speaking to British military or RIC or black and tans. And forcible hair cropping was probably the most common type of violence, gendered, I would argue, sexualized violence committed against women. And, you know, the research by various people over the last number of years, and it's good to see it being included in mainstream histories as well as dedicated researchers doing this, has shown that this was much more widespread than we had thought, that it is reported in national and international newspapers. So it is something that is very well known about at the time. And so not only is the actual experience of the violence a trauma, but the threat of that violence is always there as well. And a number of different groups particularly are targeted, like female barrack servants, because as part of the RIC boycott, for example, you know, you weren't supposed to sell them anything, you weren't supposed to talk to them, engage with them, but you also weren't supposed to work with them. And an awful lot of the barrack servants are poor widows or poor married women, probably the income in the family that kept the family from extreme poverty would have been a low but very secure income. And the threatening letters and the attacks on these women's houses, you know, gunshots, physical assaults, sexual assaults, and forcible hair cropping of barrack servants is a huge issue during 1920 and 21. And it does stop them working. And of course, that means the work of the RIC is held back, because now they have to do their own cooking and cleaning. Again, shows you the importance of women's work in any organization, because when they have to do it, they don't have as much time to be doing the military work.
So it sounds like there's a class element there, Mary, in some of the violence that we're talking about.
Even particularly, not so much with the Cumann women, because the Cumann women are being targeted by the black and tans, and often it's a tit for tat thing. For example, in September 1920 in Galway, one woman who had given a witness statement to a court of inquiry at on the killing of Constable Crum was hair cropped by the IRA, and in retaliation, the black and tans hair cropped 4 Cumann women. And then the following month in Lixna in County Kerry, a young woman had been hair cropped because her brother was about to join the RIC. What that she had to do with that, who knows? But he was beaten up and her hair was cropped, showing the gendered distinction in punishment. And later that evening, 4 young women in Lixna were hair cropped, members of Cumann in retaliation. So you do have that tit for tat as well. But the vast majority of women who are hair cropped are actually hair cropped by the Republicans, Sinn Féin, some by Cumann. And in fact, I would say the women are identified, their behaviours are identified in intelligence briefings given mainly by Cumann to Republican men, who then do the work.
Right. So that's very interesting. And so I mean, I suppose, how do I just, I mean, I kind of got the impression from the statements and things that I've read that the IRA and the volunteers did it to a certain extent out of frustration, because they weren't very successful in stopping Irish girls in any from going with British soldiers. That they managed, that they did it, and they were quite regularly kind of defied the IRA, and the IRA couldn't actually, they could target individuals, but they actually didn't really manage to put much of a dent in it. Would you agree with that? Anybody?
Yeah, Margaret.
Margaret?
I was just going to say something slightly different, that there seems to become this tactic, this violence against women. You see it in very disturbing examples, and in the North, I presume that these are Republicans, but these are attacks on loyalists. So, and it's been looking for example, a loyalist brother who happens to be in the specials or in an orange band, and they've gone to his house and he's not there. They've taken out his flags and regalia and burnt them, but then they've also cropped his sister's hair. Or another example is of a man working in the shipyard who's not there, and they go to his house and crop his wife's hair. Now, presumably they're Republicans, nationalists. Why they're doing it, I don't know. Why these women? It's not because they're working in the police barracks or anything like that. They simply happen to be female relatives of men of a different political persuasion, and that becomes very disturbing when it starts to become like that, and you feel that it's not part of a war as much as a war on women, as Lil Conlon talked about it. And there's another example of a shop assistant in the Lisbon Road when that's been robbed. They hold her down, put a potato sack on top of her to keep her down, and cut her hair off. And she's a shop assistant. That goes to court, and she recognises the men and the area that they come from. They are obviously Catholics, so they're nationalists in some way. Again, that needs to be unpicked as to what is happening at that time. And it's very, very disturbing. And it does seem more widespread than we would have thought of. And it covers large parts of the country.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a notorious case of the woman in Roscommon who they took pig rings and clamped them to her bone.
There is a second case of that in Clare. So there are two cases that we know of where pig rings were put in the buttocks of women.
Yeah.
One in Clare.
Now, see, the thing is, I wonder about the idea of that this is kind of euphemisms for much. For what actually happened to these women was probably a lot worse than I mean, sticking a pig ring up your bottom is a terrible thing to happen, in itself. But sometimes you get the impression that it, both with the hair cropping and with these incidents, it was a lot worse than that. Like they beat the crap out of them as well as shaving their hair.
And
these women are fainting, they're senseless after it. It's not just a little bit of a hairdresser's scissors. No, these are really brutal attacks in the main.
Yeah, Lil Conlon refers to that. She says that the women had their hair cropped and suffered other insults and indignities. And our host said, what about Maggie Doherty? During the Civil War, there's some pretty horrific rapes, gang rapes as well, that happened to these women. And they're obviously written about as rapes. Maggie Doherty in Mayo, Mrs. McGill up in Armagh. There's one down in Tipperary. There's a few around that are coming out now in as more papers are released in the military archives. But there's also the fact that when these women are hair cropped, they're taken out in their night clothes usually. And they're separated from the rest of their household. They're surrounded by a gang of men. So I would suggest, I mean, not just imagine, I would suggest that there is much more happening here than just having their hair cut off. But of course, women even now don't want to talk about those sort of assaults that are made on them. And then they talk about outrage. An outrage was committed. I was outraged. My dignity was insulted. So you have to unpack the language that they're using where these things are reported. And a lot of times they aren't reported. So, in many ways, the absence of evidence doesn't mean that, this was a clean war. It certainly wasn't in terms of gender violence.
How little has changed.
A lot of people under the influence of drink as well. So like a lot of the violence that was carried out in the Civil War prisons, the officials were drunk, and during the move from Kilmainham to North Dublin Union, again, a lot of the searchers were drunk, and clothes were literally ripped off women. So that was an assault on women. And I think what's interesting is that it's women and men who are ripping clothes off other women. But again and again, in a lot of the testimony coming out of the prisons is how drunk the officials were. And that once they drank a huge amount, then the threat of sexual assault and violence became greater.
And so what happened to these women's activists afterwards? I mean, because, especially if they'd gone anti-treaty, because certainly in the 20s, it was quite difficult for to a certain extent for some anti-treaty men in the 20s, but for women sometimes who were really, who'd been called names and called Amazons and all that, and they'd been to prison. Ireland was a very conservative place. You know, so you have these women who've been through, who've been in prison, who weren't married, and these are things that would have really considered to have compromised your reputation. I mean, do we know much about that, about what happened?
I think class and
education,
I think class and education are important in that context.
Yeah,
so, like somebody like Dorothy McCarthy is able to transcend. Okay, she has to give up her teaching career. She had a job in Alexander College, and she does face kind of a bleak vista while she's in jail. What is she going to do with her life now? But clearly, she's very well educated, very intelligent. She's able to put her pen to the service of the Republican cause. Mary McSweeney likewise had third level education, so that although like she devoted her life to continuing to say now, she did have income to fall back on. She ran a private girls' school in Cork St. Rita's. So those women were, educated and could carve out an alternative life for them. But there are lots of other women who emigrated, or a lot of the pension files show a huge amount of anxiety around money and just poverty amongst women who apply in the 1940s, later 1930s and into the 40s.
Yeah, I mean, people like Maura Comerford, she says she retreats to a poultry farm down in Wexford and is trying to scrape out a living and can't really afford to come up to Dublin very much. She comes up on a motorbike when she can afford the petrol. It's very, very bleak for a lot of those women for quite a long time. In the north, women who lost their jobs because of their involvement never got work again in the Six County government, with a very hostile unionist government in power. And the ones who apply most of them suffer very poor health. Rose Black, for example, goes blind through her prison experience. The white walls have been very detrimental to her eyesight. Others have had nervous breakdowns. Family businesses have collapsed.
Yeah, Bridie
one woman who'd been very well off, unusually so in Tyrone. She and her husband have been mill owners, and after that, nobody would buy off them. It collapsed. Her husband went to America looking for work, and she says, died a disappointed man, leaving me penniless with 4 children. So a lot of women suffered substantially because of their involvement politically. What you do have is, as Leeann says, the women who've got third-level education or a middle-class background. I mean, even the Hannah-She Skeffingtons couldn't teach for quite a while in the Free State. She was lucky because she got money as a journalist for an American newspaper for a while. But they're really scraping on the bottom. But what they seem to do is try and support each other as best they can. They have things like a walking group they call the Pilgrims. They meet together. A lot of them are single women, or they're women in lesbian relationships. So they live what I can see is a very women-centered existence. A lot of them have lost their men through death, executions or whatever. So their lives are very different. But I think what's extraordinary is the amount of support they give each other. A lot of them maybe live it's sisters living together, for example, and pooling resources. But it is
that's what Sonia Passacia says. She said that that women's friendship is a very noticeable feature of the activists in a way that is distinct to women, right? That didn't happen to the same extent as men. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that because, funnily enough, in doing the research on Margaret Skinnider, she had kept diaries, but mainly because of her relationship with Nora O'Keeffe, her executor burnt all the diaries when she died. So, where do you find somebody? And I found loads of letters from Margaret and her partner, Nora O'Keeffe, to Hannah in the Hannah-She Skeffington archives. And in those letters, they talk about everything. In 1937, Margaret writes a letter saying we need a strong women's organisation to go up against the Constitution. But Margaret is also, and I don't know, I wish I had the letters Hannah wrote back to Margaret. Hannah lent Margaret and Nora money in the early 1920s when they had absolutely no money, because neither of them, as anti-treatyites, well-known anti-treatyites, could get work. And of course, Margaret famously applied for the pension and didn't get it. They said because of her not being a soldier in the masculine sense, but really because she was an anti-treatyite. And I mean, her life is pretty poverty-stricken until she manages finally. She's a trained mathematics teacher, had gone to college in Glasgow. She finally gets a job in 1928-29 in the Sisters of Charity in North King Street, where she spends the rest of her life. And this is why she joins the INTO. So there are some women who manage it, but they are helped by other women. But if you read again the pension applications, the women really need that money.
They also feel very betrayed, I would think.
When they feel very betrayed about it, the amount, like getting the grade E was just horrendous for them. And the fact that so much of what they did wasn't being recognized as part of the military campaign. And a lot of them write letters of disgust about how they had given their all for Ireland, and they're getting this pittance, really, when you compare it to what some of the men are getting. But I don't think any woman gets higher than a grade D.
Bridie O'Malone talks about how her mother had given her a draper's business. She inherited a draper's business, so it's like what Margaret was about the mill owner, but she couldn't manage or look after the draper's business while she was involved during the War of Independence and Civil War. So the draper's business has gone into kind of decline, and she's kind of horrified at getting a grade D, which is the better option for but she can't actually appeal it, she says, because she actually needs the money.
And she also says before the Civil War, she just had got a well-paid job which she gave up to take part of the Civil War.
Yeah. And do you think, so I suppose in terms of like, we have much greater awareness now of what women did in the period. Do you think it's evened out? Because it used to be a lot of talk about how women were forgotten. And do we think that that's changed now? Do you think they've been integrated into revolutionary histories enough, or are we still?
No. I think it's changing. I think it's beginning. There is a certain move. I don't think so much women were written out as the bit that was written about them was just, giving them a little bit. They did some stuff and that was it, and that was grand. I think now we get way more, but it still seems like in many of the mainstream history books as an add-on, rather than fully integrated history that takes in all of these aspects. And the thing is, historians can do that if they want to. It just doesn't seem that some people want to.
I still think even if you teach mainly gender and women's history, that you're kind of considered sometimes, not really equal with your colleagues in the school or in the department. I don't want to overstate that, but sometimes I kind of feel that I'm kind of like out there in a ghetto, and that my other colleagues are doing kind of real history, kind of European history or male revolutionary history, etc. But I'm got old now and I don't care. I'm happy doing what I'm doing, but the younger me would be kind of all prickly about it.
Yeah. Margaret, do you think much has changed from when your book first was published in 1995? What changes do you think has happened in terms of women's history?
It was first published in 1983, and
sorry,
that's a reprint in 95.
I apologize.
That's okay. I remember when I wrote something else, The Missing Sex, just looking at how women weren't included in sort of key texts coming out at the time. What really surprised me when that pamphlet came out is that I was living in England at the time, but I must have spoken in practically every Irish local radio station, and all the researchers seemed to have had history degrees. And they all said they hadn't learned anything about women in Irish history at the time, and therefore they were just thrilled to have something that they could put on as a programme. So I was thinking, well, things must have changed now, because there are so many texts out there. It's all, it is difficult. When I was researching or wanted to research, I was told at Queen's that I couldn't research it because women hadn't done anything. If they'd done something, it would have been written about.
Are you going to name names, Margaret?
22. I won't at the moment. So, things have changed in that sense. And I had hoped that there would be this younger generation now coming up who would be, much more gender fluid in how they would look at history. But I'm disappointed to hear Leeann talk of her experiences now. But
students are probably different, so I mean, the classes are still full, and there is an interest. But certainly I do feel in the school, I mean, my colleagues are all very nice, don't get me wrong, but I still feel that they do kind of think I don't really do history.
Yeah. And do women, like, if you're teaching gender history, like, is it mostly women who are in the classes, or do you get a mix?
No, a mix, yeah. And like, I mean, Margaret's point about gender fluidity, I mean, that is going to help, I mean, there are people who are interested in it, of whatever gender, or, kind of non-binary, etc. But it's at kind of establishment level, I think there's still a problem.
Yeah. No, okay, that's interesting. I mean, Mary, because I was like, one of the interesting things about Margaret Skinner is she was kind of a gender bender. I mean, she loved dressing up as a man and upsetting people when they.
Yes, but interestingly, she only did that in the Easter Rising during the War of Independence. She's very much your normal Cumann woman, well, a very active Cumann woman, running a safe house, propaganda, fundraising, transporting dispatches and arms and ammunition. But of course, she was involved in a same-sex relationship with her partner, Nora O'Keeffe. And that's another thing that has come out that I'm interested in and working on, is the number of women who were political women who were involved in same-sex relationships with other women, like Kathleen Lynn, Madeleine French-Mullen, Elizabeth O'Farrell, Julia Grennan. And what all of this research on the revolutionary era is showing is the richness of our histories, not just gender history, but LGBT history, class history, diaspora history. Leeann has looked a lot at, the single women who committed their lives to politics. And I think it's very, I've been struck looking at the military service pension files, and I haven't done a study of it or gotten statistics, but it occurs to me that an awful lot of these Cumann women don't get married for whatever reason. I think maybe because they were vocal women, maybe because they were traumatized by the revolution. There must be some reason why there's a significant number who don't marry. And I think questions like that need to be asked. We're still coming up with new questions we need to ask of the material. And that's obviously the fascinating thing about history. It isn't that it remains static, it's that it's ever changing in the way you ask questions and how you approach the material and the analyses you look at it, and also the lens you take. And I think for me, I would always say now that I take a gendered lens and a feminist lens, and this idea that somebody can be totally objective and that mainstream historians are not using a particular lens or lenses to look at history. Of course they are. We just need to admit it, I think.
By studying women in the revolutionary period, and with all the new material that's coming from the MSPC, for example, we are also learning more about men in the period. And I think that's really, really important, that if we know more about women, we also know more about men. And that makes the whole picture more complex and more nuanced. And, the interpersonal relationships, the way in which relationships maybe are different, in one unit of the IRA vis-a-vis Cumann than in another. So I really I'm always trying to say to my students that we're not just looking at women here in this module. We're looking at, gender. We're looking at men and women, how women interact with each other, how men interact with women, etc. So I think that's important to stress.
Yeah, Mary, I just have a question about the women in the lesbian relationships. I hope this isn't come across as too obtuse or anything, but how do they describe their relationships? Do they use the word lesbian?
No.
Do they talk about, is it obvious that, do they talk about their as their good friends, or or do they identify them as partners, or how does it?
Well, it's different for every couple that I've looked at, and you have, and this is a limited study. Obviously, there's a much broader LGBT history out there in this period. So this is a limited study of about 8 different couples that I have identified. 1 or 2 of them talk about love of each other. The Margaret Skinner, obviously, when I was doing that research, I got access to her grandniece's photographic archive. And it's very obvious from the photographs that Margaret and Nora are a couple. The diaries I still weep about to this day, if we had them, not just because of the Margaret and Nora relationship, but what she would have been writing about. I mean, she was in the INTO, she was campaigning against the Constitution, she was doing so much in this, she was in Clonna Publica, all of this sort of thing. And then other ways, you approach the archives looking at how the relationship is described by others. For example, Rosamund Jacob talks about Kathleen Lynn and Madeleine French-Mullen as a couple in many ways in her diary. So you read them through other people, through their own works. With Julia Grennan and Elizabeth O'Farrell, because they don't leave personal material, I was looking at the obituaries and at their wills. And, when Elizabeth dies, Julia is in the position the widower would be in the description of the mourners. And then when you go into the National Archives or the National Library, where those papers are, it's people all around the world sending sympathy to Julia, not to Elizabeth's biological family, but to Julia. And the way they talk about, Julia then gives an interview, and the way she talks about Elizabeth, they were a partnership. And in many ways, it doesn't matter whether they were a sexual partnership or not. They were each other's significant other in this, and how we construct that. So it's a complicated way. In many ways, you have to use different routes through the archives in order to define these relationships. But for example, Margot Trench, there are love letters to her in the National Library from another woman, and they're very obviously love letters. So some of them are very obvious, some you have to read in, around, and through the different archives.
And then I was thinking of Mary Equi, the American
Mary Equi,
doctor, who's a very bad lesbian. I mean, she makes no bones about it. But she hosts a lot of the Irish women who are coming and doing tours. And her letters, then, she talks about Kathleen O'Brennan and people like that. She kind of makes kind of assumptions about people because, she's part of a group that don't hide who they are or what they are. Yeah.
There's actually an FBI file about Mary Equi and Kathleen O'Brennan describing their deviant relationship.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so it's one to know. I suppose we've got about 5 minutes left. Is there anything you think that we haven't covered here that we need to talk about more? I mean, what do you think? Well, say, for instance, if we're learning about women's activism in the Irish Revolution, I mean, Mary, you've talked about it a little bit, but where are the areas that we really need to develop that we don't know enough about?
I think something you asked about earlier, the later lives of those women. I really think that's really interesting, and I have a PhD student now who's going to be working on that topic. I think that's interesting. We know about the later lives of the more prominent activists, but something that the new material has shown us is that there's loads and loads of women who weren't leaders but who worked extremely hard, and to maybe kind of think about how did they live their lives, that I think would be really interesting.
Because when you think about it, it was a very short period, a decade in their lives. Many of them live on into the 1950s, 60s, 70s. So I think that's a very interesting thing. I've been trying to follow some of the women who were violently assaulted and see what happened to them, because I was interested in seeing, particularly the women accused of company keeping, how because they're shamed and stigmatized in their communities. It's written on their shorn hair. What happens to them afterwards? And because we have the names of them, and it would be amazing if the 1926 census was released, because then you would get some more information, because you have 1911 and then 26. But looks like we'll have to wait till 2026, despite promises of early release. But fine, I found out what happened to some of them, and I thought maybe would they have ended up in a Magdalen laundry, but so far not.
Or did they emigrate?
Or did they? Some of them immigrated, yeah. And then you wonder at the motivation to immigrate was to get away from that community in which you had been attacked and shamed.
Or you went into silence. Like my own grandmother, we discovered in later life, after she was dead, was probably in Cumann during the War of Independence. Now, she never said it. She was a national school principal, but she was always kind of very left of centre. She kind of walked out of her family home when my grandfather died and literally never walked back, didn't take her possessions with her. Conducted a campaign when I was young to have a teddy bear I had called Harold, named Horick, because no self-respecting Irish woman could have a teddy bear called Harold. But she obviously retreated into a certain level of silence about what she did. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think the dependence applications now coming online will be very interesting to see if there are more parents, for example, looking for compensation, what happens to the children, particularly their daughters.
Yeah. I mean, because there was a lot of didn't more women than men emigrated in the interwar period, didn't they?
Yeah.
I mean, young women left Ireland in droves. Whether
Yes.
they
Oh yeah.
I mean, when you look at the nominal roles and they're trying to remember who was in their different branches, so many of them are in Canada or America or New Zealand or wherever.
Yeah, no, that's the same with the...
And quite a lot die young. So you have to wonder of the impact of trauma and their nerves and the impact on their health. As Leeann mentioned earlier, they were out in all weathers. A lot of them might have gotten PRC, TB. There was a young woman who was released from Kilmainham jail in the Civil War and died about 2 weeks after she got out of TB, which she probably picked up.
I think intergenerational trauma would be interesting as well. I mean, that's something that would be interesting.
Yeah. Here, and I suppose we're actually come to the end of our time. I just noticed I've missed a question here. What is the extent of Protestant women's participation in the War of Independence? What do we know anything about that, Margaret? Or anybody?
Well, Protestant
we know the obvious ones about Kathleen Lynn, but do we know about? If you don't know, you don't know.
Well, I think there were some senior Protestant women who were committed nationalists or Republicans, but I don't know anything of like outside of that class of women. No.
Governor Bruder was.
Governor Bruder is the one that sort of comes to mind.
Yeah.
In the north, you've had the women of the Glens of Antrim, some of whom were Protestant. Margaret Dobbs, I think, who was in the first executive of Cumann, but doesn't seem to have stayed with the organisation. At least I've not come across her since. So that's a whole other area that could, we all know the different threads, but maybe all of that could be linked and more work done on that as well.
Yeah, Conor Morrissey, by the way, has published has written a monograph about Protestant revolutionaries and Protestant radical nationalists. So I don't know how much he writes about women, but certainly there's a book about that. Okay, well, I think that's been a really interesting and wide-ranging discussion that I think and I've learned a lot. And thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess that's it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.